When I was first asked to talk at this conference, I was just told it was about the single market. But a month ago, when I got the flyer for the event, the headline in bold type was "Saying No to the Single Market." Well, you know, I've been observing the Bruges group for many years now, and if I'd known the conference's title was either going to be saying yes to the single market or saying no, my shrewd guess would have been that it would be saying no. As it happens, I'm in favour of a single market. I hope everyone's hearing is okay. I said a single market, not the single market. What do I mean by a single market? Essentially, global free trade. The whole world must continue to be our oyster. I'm against any parochial EU attempt to construct a fortress Europe. Surprising as it may sound, we in Britain really don't crave economic union with Greece or Latvia. We simply want a free market, which is more than our partners do. Their ideal still seems to be the common agricultural policy, which aims to protect producers who can't compete and leads to higher food prices and higher taxes. That's not in the interests of consumers. Each year sees more CAP, corruption, fraud and waste. Occasional talk about reforming it is just a charade. I deliberately use a French word. I'm not this morning going to talk about, in any detail, about specific costs and benefits of the single market, but I'm sure other speakers will be doing that. From a British viewpoint, in any overall cost-benefit analysis of the EU's single market, the key point is this: the benefits, such as they are, apply only to the proportion of UK GDP exported to other EU countries, while the costs of EU regulation and bureaucracy are a burden on the whole of our economy. The UK exports over 20% of its GDP, with under half going to the EU. So the UK exports roughly 10% of its output to other EU countries. But while the single market's benefits apply to 10% of our output, the costs affect 100%. And in future, for demographic and other reasons, the proportion of UK output going to other EU countries is going to get even smaller than it is now. So a bad deal will become even worse. It's worth bearing in mind, by the way, that tariff levels today are very much lower than they were when we entered the common markets, customs union, many years ago, nearly 40 years ago now. So being outside the single market wouldn't be the end of the world. Last week on Any Questions, I expect some of you heard it, someone said the EU isn't fit for purpose. But I disagree. The EU's purpose is ever closer union, regardless of the wishes of most Europeans. And in fact, the EU's anti-democratic setup has been deliberately designed for its political purpose. Christopher Story, who died recently, wrote a book 10 years ago with a sobering title. It was called The European Union Collective, Enemy of its Member States. That may seem a bit extreme, but it's no coincidence that the EU both discourages referendums about the EU in member states and ignores the results when they go the wrong way. That's not a coincidence. They're even prepared to ignore the terms of European treaties when it suits them. Remember the Stability and Growth Pact? Remember the no bailout clause? We British Eurosceptics sometimes make a mistake on this important point. Most of us think ever closer union is such a mad idea that we can't believe other people really want it. But the Eurocrats really do want it, as do some of the senior politicians in our own country. And we shouldn't underestimate their determination to pursue that aim through thick and thin. I'm going to talk mostly about one aspect of the EU and the single market, namely the market process versus the political process. That may sound a bit abstract, but I think it's relevant. We must always remember the European Union's a political project, not an economic one. The market process is on the whole voluntary. In contrast, government action represents the political process as opposed to the market process. It involves not just the public sector versus the private sector, but collective versus individual choice, and compulsion versus voluntary activities. Those who favour the market, like me, may be called market optimists or government pessimists. We tend to assume that on the whole, leaving things to the market will in the long run turn out to be the most sensible policy, and that governments will somehow often manage to mess things up. But we're not anarchists. There are, and there need to be, some regulations and legal constraints, for example, in enforcing property rights. On the other hand, those who favour government intervention are government optimists or market pessimists. They often emphasise so-called market failures. Modern economists sometimes refer to a straw man of perfect competition, based on perfect knowledge, zero transaction costs, and so on. They regard any shortfall from such an unreal description as market failure, and then suppose that governments can correct it. But as Alfred Marshall used to ask many years ago, do you mean government all-knowing, all-wise, or governments as they are today? A good question. In order to benefit consumers, the classical economists normally preferred voluntary markets with private property rather than state coercion, often aiming to protect producers. 150 years ago, they perceived corruption in government as more of a problem than we do today, at least in the United Kingdom. One of my favourite private eye stories appeared soon after the euro had started. It reported the EU commissioners as saying that the euro had fallen so far against the dollar that in future they'd prefer their bribes to be paid in dollars. Maybe, like Arthur Selden, the classical economists regarded the market as corrigible and the government as incorrigible. I think most of us have come to regard the European Union as incorrigible. The European Union, as you know, was recently awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, which prompted Nigel Farage to remark that it showed the Norwegians, who awarded the prize, had a sense of humour. At least the EU wasn't awarded the Nobel Prize for Economics. That really would have been adding insult to injury. In the last 100 years, real national income per head in the UK has multiplied about 5-fold. It seems paradoxical that at the same time, government spending has increased roughly from 12% of national income to 48%. That implies a 20-fold real increase in government spending in a century. So government has become far more important than it used to be through most of our history. And in recent years, widespread regulation has become a major threat to the market system. The EU interferes coercively in many areas of life. But some freedom remains in a country as long as you're able to emigrate from an oppressive regime and take your personal property with you. Preventing a nation state escaping from the EU would be like forbidding a customer to switch from one supplier to another. I'd argue that it was the diversity of political conditions in European countries that led to Europe's world dominance for half a millennium. So harmonising the rules across different countries, which the EU is very fond of, can be extremely damaging. International harmonisation, in my opinion, probably does more harm than good. I'm convinced that's true in accounting. The market system's a trial and error system, and there's a good deal to be said for competition between regulators. In the democratic political system, you get one vote every 4 or 5 years on a whole package of unenforceable promises between so-called rivals that are often very hard to distinguish. In non-democratic systems, you probably don't even get that. In contrast, in the market system, people make millions of separate choices between competing suppliers in what's been called a daily democracy. The government's attitude to markets is nicely summed up by the way that Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs now refer to taxpayers as their customers. Real customers have the power of choice, and in particular of exit. But you wouldn't get far if, when invited to submit an income tax return, you politely wrote back to HMRC saying, "Thanks very much, but I think I'd prefer not to join." Once government benefits have become established, like winter fuel payments or free bus passes, in a democracy it's very difficult to remove or reduce them, whether they're really justified or not. Hence, cutting government spending is not at all easy. There's been some unfavourable comment, as we've all seen recently, in this country about the inexorable likely increase in the EU's budget over the next 7 years. But it's worth noting that despite all the talk of austerity, the UK coalition government itself plans to increase its own spending over the 5-year life of the current parliament. Increase, not reduce. To be fair, one must admit there's one important advantage in the EU setup. Their appointed political leaders don't have to worry about getting re-elected, which seems to be the #1 priority for democratic politicians. For example, it seems to me wholly disgraceful that British governments have delayed and continue to delay decisions on nuclear power and airport capacity for short-term political reasons. As against that, of course, one has to set the even more important advantage of democracy. From time to time, we the people can throw the rascals out. There's no question of doing that with the European Union, which is why I continue to regard it as an alien tyranny. Market prices represent both signals and incentives. If there are shortages, market prices rise, which in time tends both to reduce consumption and to increase production, thus getting rid of the shortages. With surpluses, it's the other way round. Market prices fall, which tends to increase consumption and reduce production, thus getting rid of the surpluses. That's just elementary economics. When you don't allow markets to work properly, you can end up with shortages, for example in housing, or surpluses, such as wine lakes and butter mountains, and unemployed workers, which of course represent a surplus of labour. That's when you don't let markets work. The profit motive spurs business people to discover what consumers want and how much. Segmenting the market means trying to distinguish between different customers and their different requirements. We're not all the same. But governments often prefer a one-size-fits-all approach, which seems much less likely to satisfy all consumers. The EU is particularly prone to this fault, even though it covers a vast area with very different environments. Competition is central to the market system, but there's a potential problem. Those producers who might be hurt by competition are known, and they're often rich and powerful, while those who probably gain are unknown nobodies, or not yet anybody's. And consumers who would certainly gain are so widely dispersed that politicians feel able to ignore them. You remember Adam Smith said, the main purpose of production is consumption. That's a view that governments don't always adopt. The result is there may well be more effective political demand for suppressing market rivalry than for permitting it, let alone encouraging it. And this is likely to be especially strong in relation to imports. Hence, protectionism is always a possible threat to free markets, especially, as we know, in the EU. So it can often pay pressure groups to invest substantial resources in political lobbying. They hope to get large returns from their rent-seeking. Most of the benefits accrue to their own members, while the community as a whole bears the costs. That's why so many pressure groups have emigrated to Brussels, where power now lies. The market system is one of profits and losses, so at least as a general remedy for failure in the market, incompetent or unlucky producers who fail to satisfy consumers, make losses, and in the end can go bankrupt. That's the good news. The bad news is no such fate awaits governments or government agencies that fail. They seem to carry on failing forever. Indeed, as we see with the EU, the difficulty of getting rid of political failures may be a serious problem. Arthur Selden, who founded the IEA with Ralph Harris, he said, the test of the relative significance of government and market failures is less in their frequency than in the ease with which they can be escaped. The Eurozone provides a terrible example of government failure and of the weaknesses that can occur when politics dominate market factors. Many people predicted that the Eurozone was by no means an optimal currency area and said it could only work if there were first political union. But the powers that be took no notice. They were so obsessed with their vision of a United States of Europe. I'm reminded of the last paragraph of The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, the year we lost our American colonies. Adam Smith wrote, "The rulers of Great Britain have for more than a century past amused the people with the imagination that they possessed a great empire on the west side of the Atlantic. This empire, however, has hitherto been not an empire, but the project of an empire, not a gold mine, but the project of a gold mine, a project which has cost, which continues to cost, and which, if pursued in the same way as it has been hitherto, is likely to cost an immense expense without being likely to produce any profit." Forgive me for reading that out, but I thought some of you might not have in your memory the last paragraph of The Wealth of Nations. I doubt if I'm alone in seeing parallels between Adam Smith's description of the American colonies, especially their cost, and the European Union, with its vainglorious project of an empire on the east side of the Atlantic. It doesn't make sense, in this case, to wait for the continental Europeans to declare their independence from us. Instead, the time has surely come for us to declare our independence from them and quit the European Union.
Yeah.
Thank you.